Where does it record from?
Go!
I don't know. Outer space,
Oh,
probably.
you're gonna edit this out anyways. It doesn't matter.
Where I've been starting with the other classes is rewinding the clock to the First Continental Congress. This was a response to the Intolerable Acts. Hopefully, you can identify what the intolerable acts were and why, at least on the outset, this whole movement for independence starts in New England. Okay? A couple of things we need to cover today. Number one, how we go from having a war for independence mostly in New England to drawing in the middle colonies and the southern colonies. Okay, I intend to answer that today. Another theme that we're going to be covering is the role of the Enlightenment. Okay, you think about the Dark Ages or these times when religion or superstition have been the source of reasoning for whatever people can't explain, whether it's who should control a government or why the sky is blue. Turning to religion and superstition to answer those particular questions is not an enlightened approach. The 18th century, the focus of philosophers and scholars and educated people was on philosophies that pushed for scientific reasoning, right? You think about Isaac Newton was a product of the Enlightenment. There were other philosophers like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, these guys that looked at politics and believed that you should be able to explain logically and through reasoning why a government can control its people. Okay? These philosophies, these political thoughts are going to shape Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. These other interests of philosophers such as Greek and Roman forms of government like democracy and republicanism, as well as civic duty, are going to influence this particular time period as well. So that's theme number two. Theme number three is the course of the war, or the course of this independence movement. How do we go from 13 unaffiliated, loosely organized colonies that don't seem to show up at family dinners to all 13 colonies being on board for this independence movement, okay, in 2 short years? So we've rewound the clock to the First Continental Congress, 1774, which followed the Intolerable Acts. At this point, you should know why it was New England that was most heavily affected by British laws and protests against them and the consequences for protesting against them. So let's talk about that very briefly here. Okay, why was New England the center of controversy? Why would New Englanders be the ones most supportive of independence from the start? Rob? Their economies were built around shipping and trade. So what about the laws? They affected them first, more directly, whether it was the navigation laws that prevented them from trading with France or allowed British Navy to go on board of a ship and make sure that the stamps for taxes have been applied, or whether it was the taxes themselves, charging merchants first. You think about somebody like John Hancock, whose whole livelihood was based around trade, importing goods from London. He had to go and fetch them from London so that they could be taxed there first and bring them back. Or whether he was exporting goods from the colonies. Tobacco. Could have made a killing on selling tobacco to the French, but laws from Great Britain prevented that because of mercantilism. That really draws the ire or the anger of New England merchants first. But they have to make it into an argument that this is about the rights of Englishmen, not just about economic privilege of New Englanders, but they're going to have to convince everyone that they all have something at stake. Probably the set of laws that did that best were the Intolerable Acts. So let's talk about the Intolerable Acts. Okay, Boston Tea Party happens and England cracks down. Take me through what actions against Massachusetts the Intolerable Acts did. Okay, let's start with the easiest one. What's the first? All right, Ian gets the easy one. Closes the Boston Harbor. This is going to shut down New England economy, right? They can't bring things in, they can't take things out until the tea is paid for. Well, no one wants to take responsibility for that, and plus, now everyone is being punished for the acts of a few. What other actions did the British Crown take against Boston as a result of the Boston Tea Party? Yes?
They restricted the colonial legislators.
All right, they closed down the colonial legislative body. Why would that be a violation of English rights? Impacts their self-government, right? The idea that you have a right to self-government, the right to be represented. Other actions. So New England's government is shut down. The port is shut down. We could talk about it as far as shutdowns. There's a third thing that was shut down. Yes? Did you have? Okay. The courts. And this is why it's important. With the courts, if your courts aren't open, that means that people accused of crimes can't be brought to justice. They suspended habeas corpus, which means they could throw people in jail without charging them of a crime. That's a violation of British rights. The people, if they were going to be brought to trial, would face a military tribunal instead of a court of law. That meant they weren't being tried in front of a jury of their peers, nor were they being tried in the location in which a crime allegedly happened. So you think about with felons were shipped all the way back to England. This is going to take away their right to local trial, a right to a fair trial, a right to a trial by jury. It's going to take away the right to a speedy trial. All of those are rights that you have in your Fifth and Sixth Amendments. Okay? So it's not just about taxation anymore. And these laws could affect anyone. And people are starting to see this, that these rights aren't just about wealth and the privilege of New England merchants. Okay? Which is why we get the First Continental Congress in 1774. Okay? You should have heard about this on my last Ed puzzle. The First Continental Congress, we get 12 of the 13 colonies in attendance. Georgia doesn't show up. And it really isn't because Georgia wasn't on board with it. It's just that Georgia was busy with an Indian insurrection and was trying to keep things under control there, is probably the reason that they did not participate in the First Continental Congress. So we get 12 of 13 instead of 7 of 13, which we saw with the Albany Congress, right? In this particular case, here are the big takeaways from this first meeting. Number one, the fact that they showed up, another sign of colonial unity. Number two, they continue their colonial unity with a couple signs of affiliation. Number one, they dedicate themselves to continuing the non-importation and consumption of British goods. What's that called? What's the E word if you refuse to import, export, trade, use a country's products? An embargo. So they're going to continue the embargo. They're also going to pledge themselves to mutual defense. That's going to be especially important with Lexington and Concord. When we have those first battles, colonists, militias from across the land are going to migrate to Boston. Okay? But that idea that they will mutually defend one another if hostile action takes place is another sign of colonial unity. But on the downside, or at least on the side arguing away from independence, the official action of the Continental Congress was to send off the Declaration of Rights. The whole point of the Declaration of Rights was to establish, number one, their loyalty to the crown, and number two, to plead that the king would restore their rights as Englishmen, that they would remain faithful subjects of England, and that their rights as Englishmen would be protected. That's a petition. You have to keep in mind, colonists did not have the right to free speech or freedom of the press, but they did, and this is something that falls into our First Amendment rights, they did have the right to send an official request by letter to a lawmaker. And so that's what the Declaration of Rights is. It's a petition. And I think it's important to note that it was sent to the king. The colonists' issue was not with the king. They thought young King George was a fair king. They believed that the problem wasn't with King George himself, but with his ministers, these people carrying out the laws on the king's behalf. And that if the king only understood them, if they only reached out to their king, that he certainly would side with them and support them. This is all in part of the tradition that we talked about in Edpuzzle, the most recent Edpuzzle with the Whigs. And I bring this up because in the next unit, when we're looking at the development of America's first political parties, the Whigs, the name for these British politicians that challenged the authority of the central government and wanted a government for the people, by the people, that political party name is going to be adopted later on in the times of John Quincy Adams as an American political party that lasts about this long, very, very briefly. Okay, but in this context, the Whigs were those that were challenging the authority of these ministers of the king. Okay, so they send that letter off to the King of England, and he returns a letter that says that their actions are, their petition will not be received. Okay, so they didn't even get a response to the king to this Declaration of Rights. It's ignored. So it's one thing to ask for help. It's another thing to get what you want. Declaration of Rights is going to go unanswered. Okay, but this sets us up for Lexington and Concord. Because of the Mutual Defense Pact, we know that militias start drilling and preparing for war. Now, they would say that this is an act of defense, that they're going to prepare themselves in order to defend themselves from those British soldiers who had settled up in Boston. Okay? But the British military is going to look at it as an aggressive act. You start having people drill and train and collect guns and gunpowder and bullets, and you start bringing cannon close to Boston. You start talking about independence, and it looks a whole lot like a plan of attack instead of a plan of defense. And so General Gage, who's stationed in Boston, and here you can see the physical map of the Boston area, comes up with a plan to dislodge the militia around the Boston area. So these militiamen had been gathering in these suburban towns of Lexington. And I use suburban because today they are suburbs of Boston, which is sprawled all over this region. But they're in these towns near Boston of Lexington and Concord. The other reason that they're going to march to those towns, other than to dislodge the militia, is there's rumor that colonial militant leaders, Samuel Adams, the propagandist / son of liberty, the guy who's been harassing and encouraging others to brutalize tax collectors, is hiding out somewhere here. And John Hancock, this wealthy merchant, smuggler, and supporter of independence, is also hiding out here. So if we had not won the American Revolution, it's unlikely we would know these people in a U.S. history course, high school history course. But think about it this way. We're still in Afghanistan after however many years, 17 years. And if we were to get some information that ISIS propaganda minister, somebody that is publishing ISIS propaganda on Twitter, is located somewhere in Afghanistan, or that perhaps a lieutenant of Osama bin Laden's is somewhere nearby our forces, and all we need to do is reach out and get them, we're going to reach out and get them. Okay? But this isn't the history we're telling. We're telling it from a side of patriotism. The movement for independence was a good thing because it shapes who we are today. Okay? George Washington would have ended up being a footnote had the independence movement failed. But that's why the British Army marches on Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. You know the story of Paul Revere. I go over that in my last Edpuzzle. But I want to also use this map for another pre-independence battle. Okay? So, in 1775, there were a couple of skirmishes that were important victories to the beginning of the Continental Army. Lexington and Concord is going to inspire people to flood to the Boston area. Not because it was a big military blowout, but because it inspired this sense of civic duty, the call to arms that had been addressed by the First Continental Congress. Number two, up in northern upstate New York, and you guys remember when we watched the video of Last of the Mohicans, that fort that we saw under attack is William Henry. on Lake Champlain. I'll just quickly draw a map of the state of New York. Looks something like this. Okay, and the Hudson River goes up to the top of the state, and then there's a lake, and that's Lake Champlain. That had been an important trade route and also military route. West Bend is on this river, but at the base of Lake Champlain is a fort that the British established called Fort Ticonderoga. A couple of military leaders of the colonial cause. Number one, Nathaniel Greene. Number two, a guy by the name of Benedict Arnold, who will go on to be the biggest trader in the Revolution. Launch a surprise attack against Ticonderoga, and they capture some artillery, cannon, which the colonists desperately need. And they haul it all the way back down to Boston, okay? And they set it up outside of Boston. So here again is the Boston map. And you can see here, Boston is a great port town, but it's not a great military town. This is low ground. And out here near Cambridge and Charleston, it's hilly, it's elevated. If you stand down here in Boston, you can actually look up and you can see that there's highlands out past the Charleston Harbor. So those cannon and the militiamen start to fortify these hills overlooking the peninsula of Boston, and they start shelling the heck out of the British encampment there. And it makes it unlivable for the British to stay in Boston. And so this is even before George Washington takes over the Continental Army. The British have to act. They can either stay and get shelled to pieces, they can attack the colonists and dislodge them from the hills, or they can leave town. They choose for option B, to try to dislodge the colonists out of these hills set around Boston, and with a frontal assault, fighting uphill battle, trying to get at those cannon. The British ultimately do accomplish their objective, but it comes at tremendous cost. Hundreds of British soldiers, I think something like 300 British soldiers, die in the effort to capture these hills in a battle that becomes known as Bunker Hill. One of the hills was named after a farmer who owned it. That's how they named all the hills. And the big battle was actually fought on a hill on Breed's farm, but they misnamed it as Bunker's Hill. And so the battle is known to history as the Battle of Bunker Hill. The colonists lost, but they only lost because they ran out of ammunition and gunpowder. So they were forced to retreat. So while they lost a tactical battle, they won a moral victory because they killed a bunch of redcoats, and the stories of their valor and the heroism that they showed in fighting these professional soldiers, again, acted as a great recruitment tool for the committees of correspondence. This is all before George Washington steps into the picture. These guys were ill-trained, underprepared, underfunded, undersupplied, and still summertime. Okay, you get to wintertime and those guys are going to go home if they don't have a leader, which is why George Washington stepping into the breach as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army is going to be super important. So moving forward, Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, we then get to the Second Continental Congress. Okay, May 1775. So this is still a whole year and a couple odd months before the Declaration of Independence. Now, every colony has given over some men, some militia to this cause that's taking place in Boston, but it still is largely a sectional war. The next focus I want to look at is how do we convince the middle colonies and the southern colonies to get on board? Well, the southern colonies are going to need to step up and involve themselves. We've kind of ignored the southern colonies for a little while now, not since Bacon's Rebellion have we really looked at that. We focused largely on the West and New England colonies and the middle colonies. But I just want to remind you, Virginia was the biggest colony. It had the largest population. It had the biggest bankroll, the largest economy. Okay? And there were some pretty famous people from Virginia that attended the Second Continental Congress. People like George Washington, Richard Henry Lee, one of the wealthiest families in the entire continent were the Lees. And then, of course, Thomas Jefferson, who's this young inventor, author, planter, plantation owner that people are familiar with because he was a well-known author, somebody that had written extensively about rights. Okay, he had written this pamphlet on the rights of Virginians and the history of Virginia. So there's some acknowledgement here that Virginia needs to step up. And that's why we come to, again, the enlightened ideas. In the last unit, in the last Ed puzzle, I talked about republicanism. This idea that good government gets its power from the people. The purpose of government is to protect the rights of people. So forget about government being the divine right of kings. Forget about government, the whole purpose of government being the mercantilist policy to make the homeland rich. During the Age of Enlightenment, people like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, these European scholars, are talking about, well, government can't exist unless people agree to its existence. And so the power of the government gets its authority from the people. The people give the power to the government, and so the government is responsible for protecting the rights of the people. And if it doesn't do that, you can abolish or alter the government with the right to rebel. Okay? So those ideas are getting floated around, especially by the educated elite, like Thomas Jefferson, Richard Henry Lee, George Washington. In a time where less than 1/100% of people got a college education, the people that were at the Continental Congress were incredibly bright and affluent. Over half of the members of the Continental Congress had college educations. And so they would have been reading about the Greeks and the Romans and political philosophy. Okay, that's what they loved. In the day before fortnight, the thing to do was to study Greeks and Romans and dream about what it must have been like to be a citizen soldier like Cincinnatus. Okay? So, the Second Continental Congress gets together almost a year before the Declaration. And it still is a regional divide. And the thing has become even more so. I forgot to mention this. After the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was option B, as you recall, the British decide then, we can't stay in Boston. We need to relocate to a place that is more favorable as far as a home base for our Navy. So they start feeling out what colony is closest to the problem and yet has the most loyal subjects. If you remember the history of New York, okay, New York had been a colony of the Netherlands. And then when the Dutch were chased out, the affluence and the aristocracy of New York stayed there. And so even though it was a middle colony, it was very aristocratic and a hotbed for loyalism. After the Stamp Act, the people of New York erected a gold statue. Well, it was a lead statue, painted gold, of King George. And kind of a funny story, in the Battle of Long Island, the colonists will melt that statue down and shoot little pieces of George at the British soldiers as they try to chase George Washington out of New York City, which they do. Okay, but New York then becomes the center headquarters of the British military. It's going to be more difficult in some ways to convince New York to support independence because the delegates that support independence have marked themselves and their families and their property as traitors. So I'll come back to that at the very end of this lecture. The other part of convincing the middle colonies is you got to deal with Pennsylvania. Now, the Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia, but what do you remember about the political leadership of Pennsylvania? What kinds of people were politicians or the political leadership of Pennsylvania? Quakers. What do you know about Quakers and war?
They don't like it.
They're pacifists, right? There's a element of Quakerish pacifism in Pennsylvania. Life is too good in Pennsylvania. They don't want to necessarily risk their lives and their homes and fortunes and futures on independence. In fact, one of the first actions the Continental Congress takes when it reconvenes in 1775 is to pass another petition, this time by Quaker pacifist John Dickinson, that's become known as the Olive Branch Petition. What do you know about olive branches as a symbol? It's a symbol of peace, okay? Dating back to Noah's Ark. But this idea that an olive branch is an offer for peace and restoration, that was the whole point of John Dickinson's Olive Branch Petition. It was a royal ass-kissing. And I'm not joking either. It, in very glowing, romantic terms, worships the king to his majesty, who's, his highness, who inspires devotion, whose faithful colonists only beg. And that was another thing. It begged the king to fix these problems and restore their rights as Englishmen. So this Olive Branch Petition turned the stomachs of delegates like John Adams, but most of the delegates felt like it was the best last option for the Continental Congress to make one final effort to try to restore loyalty to the crown. Well, King George III will answer this petition in 2 months' time. It takes some time to get to England and come back. And when it does, in August of 1775, when the king's response returns, it's with an official declaration that the colonists are in open rebellion, that they're traitors, and that basically the British crown, the British military, their whole purpose now is to crush the rebellion. That makes anybody that's meeting and talking about independence, all of the delegates of the Continental Congress, traitors. And this is punishable by death. Benjamin Franklin said it best when they received King George's letter that, okay, King George has made this decision easy for us. We must now all hang together, stick together, or we will certainly hang separately, be executed. Okay? We must hang together, or we will certainly hang separately. So in a way, without an ultimatum, okay, without any other option, the delegates of the Continental Congress are getting pushed towards independence. Okay? But what's the role of George Washington and the Southern colonies? They're going to be the ones that need to promote independency. And here's how they do it. Okay? John Adams, we'll find out in his presidency, is a bit of a curmudgeon. He's an old, cranky, hard to like man. And he would rather fight than be diplomatic. He grates on people's nerves. He is not a great politician in that respect. He's very headstrong. And so the effort to try to bring unity amongst the three regions really needs to be led from someone that's not from Massachusetts. The first step to the plate is going to be George Washington. Okay? If you remember, George Washington was a low-level officer or a mid-level officer from the Virginia militia. He gets his start in the French and Indian War, and he loses several battles there. But he shows up at the Second Continental Congress wearing his militia colonel's uniform. Okay? He is advertising himself as open for a proposal to head the Continental Army. And he's willing to do it for free. Okay? Now, that might sound a bit like he is trying to make an investment that would benefit him in the long run. It certainly is not. Okay? Here's the thing about George Washington. If I could create a modern day comparison, he is the Warren Buffett of his time. He is one of the wealthiest people in the entire colonies. His actual revenue of his income, his estate today would be over $500 million. Up until President Trump, if you took all the presidents from John F. Kennedy, elected in 1960, to Barack Obama, whose term ended in 2016, if you took all of those presidents and combined their personal wealth, it would still be diminished by President Washington, okay? $500 million. Now, Donald Trump is arguably or allegedly the first billionaire president. Washington didn't need to serve, okay? He could have stayed at his home in Mount Vernon and lived a good life. And when the British came and went and conquered, he would probably be no worse for wear. But going back to these values of civic duty, that the responsibility of citizens is to stand up and defend one another, to serve one another, that republicanism only works when people set aside their own interests and values. Washington believed that in the core of his soul, which is why he's willing to risk everything in order to serve this terrible ragtag group of militia who don't have matching uniforms and have never trained as a professional army or have any semblance of unity. Okay? He risks more than he stands to gain. He keeps an account while he's serving as commander-in-chief of all his own money that he spent, because he never did collect a check. He never did receive a payment for his service. He spends over 100,000 pounds, which is well over $1 million of his own money to lead this cause. And he almost is fired in the process because he is not a great military tactician. He loses more battles than he wins. He wins a few important ones that inspire loyalty, but really he's not a great military genius. Okay? But here's the thing. Now we see the southern colonies making a big investment in the war for independence, okay, with George Washington. The next Virginian that I want to talk about and their involvement in the movement towards independence, okay, King George has come back and said that the colonies are in a state of rebellion and that they're going to put this rebellion down, and the members of this Continental Congress are the heads, the leaders of this movement. As I said, it puts them in this situation where really there's no alternative, not much of an alternative for these leaders, but they don't feel that they have the authority to declare independence. They weren't elected. They showed up as influential people from their colonies. They take a break. They take a recess in 1775. They take a recess to go back to their colonies to get further instructions from their governing bodies. Okay, Richard Henry Lee, again, from the wealthiest family of Virginia, and we'll see him sing and dance tomorrow, gives the official proposal for independence. Okay, so in June, they're going to go home and get further instructions, but now there's a Virginian who is supporting this cause that New England has been supporting for quite some time. The wealthiest family putting it on the line for this particular cause. Okay? While the colonists go back, or while the delegates go back to their colonies to debate independence with their local governments, 4 delegates are going to stay in Philadelphia and actually draft up a declaration. Should independence be adopted, then we want to have something ready to go that will declare to the world that we are now an independent set of countries. An independent set of countries. Okay, and I say set of countries because it wasn't about declaring the independence of one country, it was about declaring the independence of 13. But being independent would allow them to get help from foreign countries like France, right? It would allow them to take out loans. It would allow them to tell themselves and the world that this cause was about fighting for rights, okay? Not rights as Englishmen, but to create a union that would protect the people's rights where England had failed, okay? Those delegates, again, are from all of the colonies. You can see here, John Adams made sure that he was on the list. We've got a couple from the middle colonies, but Thomas Jefferson ultimately is the one that writes the Declaration, and here's why. As I mentioned, he was well known as a writer. his words about the rights of man, and his ability to talk about enlightened values was pretty well known. Here's the thing about Thomas Jefferson, though, as a person. He may have been on the autistic spectrum. He was socially very uncomfortable and awkward. He had a high-pitched, nasally voice. He did not like to speak. He was an introvert. He was a scientist, planter, scholar. He liked to be home at his home in Monticello. But that didn't come through in his writing. And again, this whole idea of civic virtue, civic duty, comes through, and he is willing to put his words on the line. Okay? When the Continental Congress reconvenes, July 2nd, they officially adopt the Declaration of Independence. Now, as I had mentioned, they had agreed that they would adopt it universally, that it would be unanimous. We got 13 colonies. You'd think unanimous means all 13 would agree. New York abstains. New York doesn't vote on the matter because if it did, again, New York is occupied by the British, and those delegates aren't willing to risk their lives and their fortunes to vote for independence. So instead, they opt to not vote. They're convinced, they're kind of strong-armed into staying out of the vote. Pennsylvania, people like John Dickinson, they weren't unanimous. Not all delegates voted for independence, but all of the colonies supported independence, and so it passed. Okay? Now, that's July 2nd. John Adams thought, oh, July 2nd will be celebrated for the rest of history with parades and barbecues and fireworks and celebrations across the land. We know that's not true. We wait until July 4th, and here's why. For 2 days, the colonies debated the ratification of the Declaration of Independence itself. There was a big hang-up. Thomas Jefferson, in his original draft, Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, the planter, in his original draft, blames slavery on the King of England. Okay? Here's a guy, talk about contradiction, talk about hypocrisy, talk about, trying to call the pot calling the kettle black. Thomas Jefferson writes as one of his grievances that the King of England is responsible for slavery. And of course, no Southerner is going to support that particular criticism, especially if the opening of the Declaration is about the rights of all men to be created equal. Furthermore, the hypocrisy in Jefferson's own lifestyle, him being a plantation owner and owner of slaves, he argues, hey, I've made this right in my own conscience. I know what I'm going to do with my slaves at the end of my life, even though he never does free them. He's come to terms with it, but it's too controversial, and so he's forced to remove those passages before it passes. So that's what happens. That's why the Declaration takes 2 more days. Okay? All right. Now, there's one more thing that I haven't covered with you guys, and that is the other primary source you were responsible for, and that is common sense. The whole movement for independence starts as a minority movement, okay? Like I said, roughly 16% of the population are loyalists, Tories, a very small percentage. It's hard to know how many people were patriots from the start because once you win a war, everybody's like, yeah, I was always with you 100%. But it starts as a very small group, okay? How do you convince the majority of Americans that independence is the right cause? Well, it's about getting them information that is relatable, consumable, popular, emotional, and this is where Thomas Paine comes into the mix. So you guys read Tom Paine's pamphlet. It talks very clearly, very commonly about why independence is the right move. This pamphlet became wildly popular. It sold over 120,000 copies, and the average country bumpkin yokel could read it and go, you know what, this makes a lot of sense. So tell me, with our closing minutes here, what about Tom Paine's common sense made sense to you? Yes, what was most convincing?
The way he talks about how it's a month, how Britain is a mother.
Okay, the whole notion that if we are family, no family abuses each other the way that Britain abuses us. Good. What other analogies or what other? Yes, Rob.
The idea that when we were a child, we didn't need them, but like people grow up.
Okay. Life is about change, that nature changes. And this evolution means that England's relationship with America is changing too. Notice this, okay? Coming back here to enlightened thinking, both Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine try to support their arguments with evidence. Your assignment tonight and tomorrow is to look at the Declaration of Independence, and I'll collect this on Thursday, but you'll notice there's an argument, okay? Then there's evidence, and then there's a conclusion. It's written very much in this scientific reasoning. Jefferson is harder to read because he's more enlightened and talking very philosophically. Thomas Paine was wildly popular because he just wanted to talk to the common person about common sense. This is how we go from a New England war to a war that is supported by all regions. Okay? Can I get an amen? All right.